The mountain fog rolled through Pine Hollow like smoke from a dying fire, carrying with it the screams of something that had once been Martha Caldwell. She stood in her garden at dawn, pulling radishes with fingernails that had grown too long, too sharp, humming a lullaby to vegetables that withered at her touch. 3 days ago, Martha had been the sweetest grandmother in Letcher County, Kentucky. 3 days ago, she'd had a shadow. Now the earth beneath her feet turned black as charcoal, and her eyes reflected light like broken glass. From his porch across the hollow, Ezekiel Pruitt watched through field glasses, counting the minutes until Martha would need to be contained. The Pruitts had been keepers of this terrible knowledge for 4 generations, guardians of a secret that kept the mountains from descending into chaos. They knew what happened when shadows went missing. They knew how to make them disappear, and they knew that once you lost your shadow in these hills, you stopped being human in ways that mattered to God and the living alike. The Pruitt homestead clung to the side of Pine Ridge like a tick on a hound's back. Weathered barn boards, silver as old bones under the October sky. Ezekiel Pruitt stood on his front porch, coffee steaming in the cool mountain air, watching smoke rise from chimneys scattered across the hollow below. 23 households in Pine Hollow, and he could name every family, every child, every dog. More importantly, he could count their shadows. His great-grandfather, Jeremiah Pruitt, had first learned the art in 1847 during the worst winter anyone could remember. Folks were starving, and desperate people did desperate things. Jeremiah had stumbled onto something in those frozen woods, something old and hungry that offered trades no Christian man should consider. But Jeremiah had been watching his children waste away, and even good men could break when pushed far enough. The family ledger, written in Jeremiah's careful hand, still sat in Ezekiel's kitchen drawer. Page after page of careful observations, tracking which neighbors had lost weight too fast, which children had stopped casting proper shadows, which families needed watching. The Pruitts had become the Hollow's secret guardians, learning to manage what Jeremiah had unleashed. Ezekiel's father, Solomon, had refined the techniques during the Depression. Times were hard everywhere, but Pine Hollow had extra troubles. Families would disappear entire winters, leaving behind houses that stood empty, but somehow weren't quite vacant. Solomon had developed the containment protocols, the warning signs, the careful record-keeping that kept the situation manageable. Now it was Ezekiel's burden, passed down like the family rifle and the tendency toward bad knees. At 62, he'd been managing the hollow for nearly 30 years, ever since his father's heart gave out during the blizzard of 1968. His son Jacob, now 34, had been learning the trade since he could walk, though Ezekiel prayed the boy would never need to use what he'd been taught. The field glasses caught movement near the Caldwell place. Martha was inside her house now, but the garden still smoldered where she'd been standing. Ezekiel made a note in his daily log, timing the intervals between episodes. The pattern was always the same. 3 days of increasing strangeness, then the hunger began. The story of what happened to shadows in Pine Hollow required understanding what shadows were in the first place. Most people thought shadows were simply absence of light, dark shapes cast by bodies blocking the sun. The Pruitts knew better. Shadows were anchors, tethers connecting the soul to the body, keeping human nature intact. When someone lost their shadow, the change wasn't immediate. First came small things: food tasting different, sleep becoming restless, emotions feeling distant. Then the hunger started, not for food, but for something deeper. The shadowless craved warmth in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. and they'd take it from anything alive they could touch. Ezekiel's grandmother, Ruth, had been the first to understand the mechanism. In 1923, during a particularly bad outbreak, she'd noticed that the shadowless always appeared near the old mine shaft on the ridge above town. The shaft had been abandoned since the 1880s, when a cave-in killed 16 men. Local folks avoided the area, claiming it felt wrong somehow. Ruth had ventured up there with her husband and brother, armed with salt circles and prayers, determined to find the source. What they discovered changed everything the Pruitts thought they knew about their family's burden. Deep in the mine, past where any sensible person would go, they'd found a chamber that shouldn't have existed. The walls were covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, carved in patterns that seemed to move when you weren't watching. In the center of the chamber sat a box made from some kind of black stone, smooth as river rock, but warm to the touch. Inside the box, hundreds of shadows writhed like living things, trapped in darkness deeper than the space could hold. Each shadow still carried the essence of its original owner, but disconnected, they'd become something else entirely. The Pruitts realized they hadn't just stumbled onto a supernatural phenomenon. They'd discovered a system someone had built, maintained, and operated for purposes they couldn't fathom. Ruth's journal, written in precise schoolteacher handwriting, documented what they learned that day. The box was some kind of prison or storage device, designed to hold shadows indefinitely. But it was also a lure, pulling shadows from people who ventured too close to the mine. Whoever built it had created a trap that fed on human essence, slowly but systematically. The question was whether to destroy it or learn to control it. Ruth Pruitt had stood in that underground chamber for 47 minutes, watching shadows twist and writhe in their prison while her husband and brother waited by the entrance. She'd brought a sledgehammer, intending to smash whatever they found. But standing before the shadow box, she'd realized destruction might not be an option. The box pulsed with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, and she could feel it pulling at her own shadow, testing the connection between her body and soul. If she struck the stone with iron, would all those trapped shadows escape at once? What would happen to a hollow full of people suddenly reconnected to shadows that had been imprisoned for decades? More troubling was what she sensed beyond the box. The chamber felt like a doorway, and something vast and patient waited on the other side. The shadows weren't just trapped. They were being collected, gathered for a purpose she couldn't comprehend. Destroying the box might not end the threat. It might only announce their discovery to whatever intelligence had built this place. Ruth had made the hardest choice of her life that day. Instead of destroying the box, she'd learned to work with it. Her journal detailed the careful experiments that followed. She discovered she could control which shadows the box took, could direct its hunger toward specific targets. More importantly, she learned to reverse the process partially. Not enough to restore someone completely, but enough to manage them, to keep them functional enough that neighbors wouldn't notice anything wrong. Over the next decade, Ruth developed what the family called the protocol. When someone in the hollow started showing signs of shadow loss, the Pruitts would intervene. They'd assess the person's value to the community, their family situation, their likelihood of causing problems. Then they'd make a choice that no family should have to make. Some people they'd try to save. Others they'd let the box claim completely. The worst part was the ones they saved. Restoration was never perfect. People got back enough of their shadow to function, to pass for normal, but they were changed in ways that mattered. They became more compliant, less curious, easier to manage. They lost pieces of what made them distinctly themselves, becoming softer versions of who they'd been. Ruth called them the managed, and by 1935, nearly half the families in Pine Hollow included at least one managed member. The community had become something new, something that looked normal from the outside, but operated by rules no government recognized. The system worked because the Pruitts were careful, because they understood the cost of their choices, and because they never forgot what would happen if they stopped watching the hollow. But it was also a system built on control, on deciding who deserved to keep their full humanity and who could be sacrificed for the greater good. By the time Ezekiel inherited the protocol, it had become as natural as farming or hunting, a necessary evil that kept the community safe. But watching Martha Caldwell pull radishes with claws instead of fingers, he wondered if his great-grandmother had chosen correctly all those years ago. The hunger was spreading faster now than it had in previous generations. Martha Caldwell had lost her shadow on a Tuesday morning while hanging laundry. Her granddaughter, 8-year-old Lucy, had been playing in the yard when she'd noticed something wrong. Grandma Martha was pinning bedsheets to the line, but the white cloth cast shadows while Martha herself cast none. By evening, Martha was humming songs in languages that didn't exist, and her touch was leaving black marks on everything she handled. Ezekiel had received the call from Lucy's mother, Beth, who'd found Martha standing in the middle of her vegetable garden at midnight, talking to plants that withered as she spoke. The conversation had been difficult. Beth Caldwell was new to Pine Hollow, having moved here from Lexington after her divorce, and she didn't understand the unspoken rules that governed life in the mountains. "Something's wrong with Mama," Beth had said, her voice tight with fear and frustration. "She's not acting right. I think maybe she had a stroke or something. Should I call the county doctor?" The county doctor was exactly what they couldn't afford to have poking around Pine Hollow. Dr. Sarah Kim was a competent woman who asked too many questions and took too many notes. She'd noticed things that needed to stay unnoticed. Ezekiel had driven to the Caldwell place in his pickup truck, carrying the medical bag that had belonged to his grandfather. The bag looked ordinary, leather worn smooth by decades of use, but it contained tools no licensed physician would recognize. Salt mixed with copper filings, mirrors cut from specific types of glass, measuring devices calibrated for things medical school didn't teach. He'd found Martha in her kitchen, trying to cook supper for a family that wouldn't be coming. She'd set the table for 6 people, including her late husband, who'd been dead for 3 years. The food on the stove was moving, not boiling but actually writhing, as if the ingredients had remembered they'd once been alive. "Martha," Ezekiel had said carefully, keeping his voice gentle. "How are you feeling tonight?" She'd turned to him with eyes that reflected light like an animal's, and her smile had been too wide for her face. "Oh, Ezekiel, I'm wonderful, just wonderful. Would you like to stay for supper? I made enough for everyone who ever mattered." That's when he'd known for certain. Martha was too far gone for partial restoration. The shadow box had claimed her completely, and what remained was something wearing Martha's face but operating by different rules. She was dangerous to herself, to her family, and to every living thing in the hollow. Ezekiel had made the call that night. Martha Caldwell would need to be contained. The containment facility sat 3 miles up the ridge from Pine Hollow, accessible only by a logging road that hadn't appeared on any official map since 1952. From the outside, it looked like an old hunting camp. Rough-hewn cabins scattered among the trees, a main lodge that could house a dozen people, storage buildings that might hold equipment for seasonal work. Inside, It was something else entirely. Ezekiel's grandfather had built the original structures in 1928, using lumber cut from trees that had never seen sunlight. The wood was dense as stone and naturally resistant to the kind of damage the contained could inflict. Each cabin was a cell, comfortable enough to house someone long-term, but secure enough to hold something that had once been human. The facility currently housed 14 residents, ranging from old Pete Hensley, who'd been there since 1961, to the Morrison twins, contained just last spring when they'd lost their shadows simultaneously during a camping trip. Some residents were manageable, able to carry on conversations and even help with simple tasks around the facility. Others, like the thing that had once been Reverend Thomas, were kept in isolation because proximity to them could affect the staff. Jacob Pruitt managed day-to-day operations, making the drive up the ridge every morning with supplies and medication. The residents required a special diet. Certain minerals seemed to slow their deterioration, and regular exposure to specific types of light that helped maintain what humanity remained in them. The hardest part was the families. Every person in containment had relatives in Pine Hollow who believed their loved one had moved away, gone to live with distant family, or died from natural causes. The Pruitts maintained elaborate fiction for each case, complete with forged letters and occasional phone calls made by family members who'd been partially restored and were willing to help maintain the deception. Beth Caldwell posed a particular challenge. She'd been asking too many questions since her mother's disappearance, and several neighbors had started avoiding conversations about Martha. The Hollow's informal communication network, usually reliable for spreading acceptable explanations, wasn't working with someone who'd brought city expectations to mountain problems. "We might need to consider management for the daughter," Jacob had suggested during their weekly planning session. "She's making people nervous, and nervous people make mistakes." Ezekiel understood the logic, but managing Beth would mean managing Lucy as well. Children were more complicated. Their shadows were more firmly attached, requiring stronger intervention that often caused developmental problems. The Pruitts had strict rules about children, and Ezekiel wasn't ready to break them. Give her another week, he'd decided. Maybe she'll settle down once she accepts that Martha's gone. But privately, Ezekiel worried they were losing control of the situation. The containment system worked because the entire community participated, consciously or unconsciously, in maintaining the necessary fictions. If too many people started asking direct questions, the whole structure could collapse. The Letcher County Courthouse in Whitesburg held records dating back to 1864, when Union forces had established administrative control over eastern Kentucky. Those records told the official story of Pine Hollow: births, deaths, property transfers, tax assessments, and court proceedings that painted a picture of a typical mountain community struggling with the usual problems of poverty, isolation, and economic decline. The unofficial story lived in gaps between the official entries. County Clerk Margaret Flynn had held her position for 23 years, long enough to notice patterns that might escape casual observation. Pine Hollow reported fewer deaths than neighboring communities of similar size, but significantly more residents who moved away without forwarding addresses. Families would appear on tax rolls for decades, then suddenly disappear from all records as if they'd never existed. Margaret had started keeping her own files in 1987, after the third time someone had called asking about relatives who supposedly lived in Pine Hollow but couldn't be found in any official database. The files filled 2 filing cabinets in her office basement, meticulously documenting discrepancies that pointed toward something unusual happening in the isolated mountain community. "People don't just vanish," she told her assistant, Carol, during one of their coffee breaks. Even in these mountains, there are always traces, death certificates, property sales, something. But Pine Hollow families just stop existing. Carol had lived in Letcher County her entire life, and her grandmother had grown up in Pine Hollow before moving to Whitesburg in the 1940s. Family stories mentioned strange happenings in those mountains, incidents that didn't quite make sense even by Appalachian standards. Grandma always said there was something off about that place, Carol had admitted. She moved away right after she got married, said she couldn't stand the way people watched each other all the time, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Margaret's research had revealed other anomalies. Pine Hollow had never reported a single case of mental illness requiring outside intervention, despite statistics suggesting every community their size should average at least 2 or 3 cases per decade. The Hollow had never requested county assistance for domestic violence, child welfare concerns, or substance abuse problems that plagued similar communities throughout the region. Either Pine Hollow was the most functional community in eastern Kentucky, or they were managing their problems through methods they preferred to keep private. Margaret had tried twice to schedule official county visits to Pine Hollow, routine inspections that every community received periodically. Both times, her visits had been postponed due to road conditions, weather emergencies, or scheduling conflicts that couldn't be resolved. When she'd driven out to investigate personally, she'd found the access road blocked by a landslide that local residents assured her had been there for months, though satellite photos showed the road had been clear the previous week. The pattern suggested coordination, planning, and resources that went beyond what a struggling mountain community should possess. Reverend David Parker had arrived in Pine Hollow in September to serve the community's small Methodist church, replacing Reverend Thomas, who had apparently retired unexpectedly to Florida. The previous minister had left no forwarding address and no transition notes, unusual for a man who'd reportedly served the congregation for 15 years. David was young, enthusiastic, and committed to rebuilding a congregation that seemed oddly passive about spiritual matters. His services were well attended, but nobody showed much interest in Bible study, community outreach, or the social programs he'd hoped to implement. When he'd suggested organizing a food drive for struggling families, the congregation had politely declined, insisting that everyone in Pine Hollow was managing just fine. More troubling were the gaps in church records. The registry showed baptisms, marriages, and funerals going back to 1912, but with strange interruptions. Entire families would appear in records for years, then disappear without death certificates or transfer letters. When David had asked longtime members about missing families, he'd received vague answers about people moving away for work or to care for relatives. The Hensley family illustrated the pattern perfectly. Records showed Pete and Dorothy Hensley had been active church members through 1961, serving on committees and contributing regularly to church funds. Then they'd simply stopped appearing in any documentation. When David had asked about them, congregation members had offered conflicting stories. Some said Pete had died in a mining accident. Others claimed the family had moved to Ohio for work. David's predecessor had left behind a locked filing cabinet that the congregation seemed reluctant to discuss. When David had asked for the key, he'd been told that Reverend Thomas had taken it with him, and they'd never been able to find a replacement. The cabinet sat in the church office like a monument to secrets no one wanted revealed. The young minister had considered forcing the cabinet open, but something about the congregation's reaction made him hesitate. There was fear in their responses, not the simple discomfort of people hiding embarrassing information, but genuine terror of consequences he couldn't understand. David had grown up in small mountain communities and understood that rural, Churches often harbored complex family secrets. But Pine Hollow felt different. The congregation seemed united by shared knowledge they couldn't or wouldn't discuss with outsiders. They were protecting something, and their willingness to exclude their own minister from whatever they were hiding suggested the secret was both dangerous and necessary. The breakthrough came when David discovered a loose floorboard in the church basement while searching for Christmas decorations. Beneath the board, wrapped in oilcloth, were journals belonging to his predecessor. The entries painted a picture of a spiritual crisis that had consumed Reverend Thomas during his final years in Pine Hollow. The last entry, dated 3 days before Thomas's supposed departure, consisted of a single repeated phrase written in increasingly erratic handwriting. God help me, I know what they're hiding, and I can't serve communion to these people anymore. Dr. Sarah Kim had been serving as county physician for Letcher County since 1991, making monthly visits to isolated communities that couldn't support full-time medical care. Her route included 12 communities scattered across the mountains, providing basic health care, monitoring public health concerns, and maintaining medical records for state oversight. Pine Hollow was supposed to be on her regular rotation, but somehow her visits never materialized. Weather delayed her trips, equipment failures required rescheduling, and emergency calls always seemed to redirect her attention when she planned to visit the mountain community. In 3 years of county service, she'd never actually set foot in Pine Hollow, despite it being clearly marked on her assigned route. The pattern became obvious when she reviewed her travel logs in preparation for her annual report to the state health department. Every other community on her route had received regular visits, documented health screenings, and follow-up care for chronic conditions. Pine Hollow existed in her paperwork as a blank space, a community that somehow managed to avoid requiring any outside medical intervention. Dr. Kim had tried calling the emergency contact number listed for Pine Hollow, a landline supposedly connected to the community's informal health coordinator. The phone rang without answer, day after day, though the line never seemed to be busy or disconnected. When she'd asked the county dispatcher about Pine Hollow emergency calls, she'd been told the community handled their own medical situations and rarely requested outside assistance. That's not normal, she'd explained to County Administrator James Walsh during their quarterly meeting. Every community needs outside medical support occasionally. Births, serious injuries, psychiatric emergencies, these things happen everywhere. But Pine Hollow apparently manages everything internally. Walsh had seemed uncomfortable with the conversation, checking his watch repeatedly and steering discussion toward other topics. When Dr. Kim had pressed for permission to make an unscheduled visit to Pine Hollow, Walsh had cited budget constraints and competing priorities that required her attention elsewhere. The bureaucratic obstacles were frustrating but not surprising. Rural county administration often involved informal agreements and local politics that outsiders couldn't understand. But Dr. Kim's medical training made her suspicious of any community that claimed to need no outside healthcare support. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source. During a routine visit to the neighboring community of Millstone, she'd treated a young man for a broken arm sustained in a logging accident. While setting the bone, she'd mentioned her inability to reach Pine Hollow for routine health screenings. "You don't want to go there anyway," the patient had said, his voice dropping to a whisper despite the privacy of the clinic. "My uncle lived there for a while, back in the 80s, said there was something wrong with the people, like they were all pretending to be normal, but you could tell they were watching each other all the time." The man's uncle, Bobby Fletcher, had worked construction in Pine Hollow for 6 months before leaving abruptly. Bobby was still alive, living in Hazard, and he'd been willing to discuss his experiences with someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding what made Pine Hollow different. It wasn't anything you could put your finger on, Bobby had explained during their phone conversation. But families would disappear overnight, and nobody would talk about where they'd gone. And there was this family, the Pruitts, who seemed to know everything about everyone else's business, like they were keeping track of people for some reason. What would you do if you were a county physician who discovered an entire community that seemed to be hiding from outside oversight? The Appalachian Regional Commission's 1994 demographic study had flagged Pine Hollow as a statistical anomaly requiring further investigation. Communities of similar size and economic profile typically showed patterns of population decline, outmigration of young adults, and increasing dependency ratios. Pine Hollow showed none of these trends, maintaining stable population numbers despite offering no apparent economic advantages over neighboring communities. Federal researcher Amanda Torres had been assigned to conduct a comprehensive community assessment, documenting resources, infrastructure, and social services that might explain Pine Hollow's apparent resilience. Her preliminary research had revealed the same gaps that had frustrated county officials: incomplete records, missing documentation, and a communication network that seemed designed to deflect outside attention. Amanda's supervisor had emphasized the importance of the Pine Hollow study. If the community had developed effective strategies for maintaining economic stability in a declining region, those strategies needed to be documented and potentially replicated elsewhere. The Commission was prepared to offer significant funding for communities that could demonstrate sustainable development models. The federal interest represented both opportunity and threat for Pine Hollow. Government funding could provide resources the community desperately needed, but federal oversight would bring scrutiny that the Pruitt family system couldn't survive. Ezekiel had learned about the impending federal visit through his contact in the county administrator's office. Margaret Flynn had called him personally, her voice tight with concern as she explained what Amanda Torres would be looking for during her assessment. "She's not some bureaucrat checking boxes," Margaret had warned. "She's a researcher with a graduate degree and federal authority. She's going to want to interview residents, examine records, and document everything she finds. You need to be ready for this." The Pruitt family convened an emergency meeting that night, gathering in Ezekiel's kitchen to develop a strategy for managing federal attention. Jacob wanted to refuse the visit entirely, claiming road conditions or safety concerns that would prevent outside access. But Ezekiel understood that avoiding federal investigators would only increase their interest and potentially bring more serious intervention. "We have to let her come," he'd decided. "But we control what she sees and who she talks to, and we make sure she finds exactly what she expects to find: a stable mountain community with nothing unusual to report." The managed members of the community would be crucial to maintaining the deception. Their altered personalities made them ideal for interacting with investigators: compliant, positive, and unlikely to volunteer information beyond direct questions. The challenge would be ensuring that Amanda Torres didn't notice the subtle uniformity in their responses or the careful way community members steered conversations away from sensitive topics. Ezekiel had 2 weeks to prepare Pine Hollow for federal scrutiny. While Ezekiel planned his federal strategy, Reverend David Parker was making a discovery that would change everything. His continued investigation of the church basement had revealed a second hidden compartment, this one containing records that predated his predecessor's troubled journals by nearly a century. The discovery happened by accident. While moving boxes in preparation for a Christmas pageant, David had noticed that the floor in one corner didn't sound right when he stepped on it. Further investigation revealed a section of loose floorboards concealing a metal box wrapped in leather and sealed with wax that had somehow remained intact, despite decades of moisture and temperature changes. Inside the box were two items: a leather-bound ledger and a letter addressed to whoever finds this record, and signed by Jeremiah Pruitt, dated Christmas Eve, 1847. The letter was brief but devastating. "I have made a bargain with something that should not be bargained with. The shadow box takes what it needs, and we control who loses what. The community survives because we choose who gets to keep their full humanity. God forgive us all, but the system works. These records document every person we have managed, contained, or lost entirely. Hide this knowledge well, for if it becomes public, the box will claim everyone in the hollow to protect itself." The ledger contained 4 generations of meticulous record-keeping: names, dates, methods of intervention, and outcomes for every case the Pruitt family had managed since 1847. Detailed descriptions of the containment facility, the shadow box mechanisms, and the criteria used for determining who could be saved and who would be sacrificed for the greater good. Most shocking were the numbers. Over 140 years, the Pruitt family had managed the shadows of nearly 800 people. 300 had been contained when restoration proved impossible. 500 had been partially restored and returned to the community as managed individuals. Only the Pruitt family members themselves had remained fully human throughout the entire period. David read through the night, his horror growing with each page. The ledger documented a systematic program of controlling and altering human nature, maintained by a single family who'd appointed themselves judges of who deserved to keep their souls intact. The community he'd been serving wasn't just harboring a terrible secret. The community itself had been deliberately created through supernatural manipulation. The final entries in the ledger, written in Ezekiel's careful handwriting, brought the horror into present focus. Martha Caldwell's name appeared with a notation: "Full containment, November 2nd, 1994. Daughter and granddaughter require monitoring for potential management." David had been planning to serve communion to a congregation that included dozens of people who'd been deliberately robbed of essential parts of their humanity. And the family responsible was now considering targeting an 8-year-old child. The young minister faced an impossible choice. Exposing the Pruitt family would destroy the community and potentially release something that had been contained for nearly 150 years. But remaining silent meant complicity in a system that treated human souls as resources to be managed by self-appointed guardians. His theology offered no guidance for this situation. Seminary hadn't prepared him for discovering that his congregation consisted primarily of people who'd been systematically altered by supernatural means. Beth Caldwell had stopped accepting explanations about her mother's disappearance. 3 weeks of vague assurances and contradictory stories had convinced her that the people of Pine Hollow were either lying or dangerously delusional. When Ezekiel Pruitt had told her that Martha had decided to move to Florida to live with relatives Beth knew didn't exist, she'd decided to take action. Her first call was to the Kentucky State Police, reporting her mother as a missing person and requesting a formal investigation. The trooper who took her statement had been professional, but seemed oddly reluctant to pursue the case aggressively. He'd promised to contact Pine Hollow residents for additional information, but Beth suspected his inquiry would be perfunctory. Her second call was to a private investigator in Lexington, a former police detective who specialized in missing person cases. Tom Bradley had agreed to drive to Pine Hollow and conduct interviews that might reveal what had actually happened to Martha Caldwell. Beth's actions terrified the Pruitt family. Official police investigation was bad enough, but a private investigator with no local connections and no stake in maintaining county relationships could destroy everything they'd built. Tom Bradley wouldn't be deterred by weather delays or bureaucratic obstacles. He'd ask direct questions and expect honest answers. The emergency family meeting convened at midnight, with Jacob arguing for immediate action to neutralize both Beth and the investigator. "We can manage Beth tonight," he'd urged. "Make it look like she had some kind of breakdown, couldn't cope with her mother's disappearance. The investigator would have no client and no case." But Ezekiel hesitated. Managing Beth would require managing Lucy as well, and 8-year-old Lucy had already begun asking uncomfortable questions about why her grandmother had left without saying goodbye. Managing a child successfully required techniques that often caused permanent developmental damage. The Pruitt family had rules about children, boundaries they'd maintained for 4 generations. "There might be another way," Ezekiel had suggested. "We could tell Bradley the truth about Martha. Not the whole truth, but enough truth that he'd understand why she had to be contained. Make him understand what's at stake." Jacob had stared at his father in disbelief. "You want to recruit a private investigator?" "Dad, the system works because nobody outside the family knows how it works. Start bringing in outsiders, and we lose control completely." But Ezekiel was thinking about Amanda Torres and the federal investigation that would begin in 10 days. If they could convince Tom Bradley that Pine Hollow was managing a genuine crisis through unconventional but necessary means, they might gain an ally who could help them navigate federal oversight. The decision would determine whether the Pruitt family system could adapt to modern scrutiny, or whether it would be exposed and destroyed after nearly 150 years of successful operation. In the mine shaft above Pine Hollow, something stirred in response to the growing crisis. The shadow box had remained dormant for decades, accepting whatever offerings the Pruitt family provided and maintaining its hold over the trapped shadows without requiring direct communication. But the threat of exposure, the possibility of losing its protected status, awakened intelligence that had slumbered since Ruth Pruitt's first discovery in 1923. Ezekiel felt the change during his weekly inspection of the mine chamber. The symbols on the walls pulsed with new light, and the box itself had grown warm enough to cast visible heat waves in the cool underground air. Most disturbing were the sounds. Whispers in languages he didn't recognize, coming from inside the box, but somehow echoing from the chamber walls as well. The whispers resolved into words he could understand, though the voice seemed to come from inside his own skull rather than through his ears. "The system is failing. The Guardians are compromised. New arrangements are required." For 70 years, the Pruitt family had operated under the illusion that they controlled the shadow box, that their careful management maintained the balance between the supernatural threat and community safety. The voice in the chamber made it clear that they'd been wrong. The box had allowed them to think they were in control because their management served its purposes, but ultimate authority had always resided with the intelligence that inhabited the black stone container. "What do you want?" Ezekiel had asked, speaking aloud to the ancient presence that had shaped 4 generations of his family's choices. "Expansion," came the reply. "The current arrangement serves a community of 200 souls. The mechanism can accommodate thousands. The investigator, the federal researcher, the minister who has found the records. They present opportunity as well as threat." Ezekiel understood immediately. The shadow box wasn't just suggesting expansion, it was demanding evolution. Instead of hiding from outside attention, they could embrace it, use federal funding and government resources to create a larger network of managed communities. The Appalachian region was full of struggling mountain towns that could benefit from the stability the shadow box provided. and federal investigators would document and promote their success without understanding its source. The price would be abandoning the careful restrictions that had limited the box's influence for nearly 150 years. No more rules about children. No more preferences for partial restoration over full containment. No more family control over who lived, who died, and who lost essential pieces of their humanity. The old guardians can remain, the voice continued, but their role will change. They will become administrators of a system that no longer requires their moral judgments. The box will make all necessary determinations. Standing in that underground chamber, surrounded by symbols that hurt to contemplate and whispers that bypassed rational thought, Ezekiel Pruitt faced the same choice his great-grandmother had confronted 71 years earlier. He could destroy what his family had built, accepting the chaos that would follow. Or he could surrender the last pretense of human control and become a servant of something that viewed human souls as renewable resources. The federal investigator would arrive in 6 days. Tom Bradley reached Pine Hollow on a gray November morning, driving a rented SUV up mountain roads that seemed designed to discourage visitors. The private investigator had 23 years of experience finding people who didn't want to be found, and Beth Caldwell's case felt familiar. Family members who'd vanished into rural communities where local loyalties ran deeper than legal obligations. His first stop was the Caldwell house, where he interviewed Beth and 8-year-old Lucy about Martha's disappearance. Beth's account was straightforward. Her mother had been acting strangely for several days, then had simply vanished one night without explanation. Neighbors claimed Martha had decided to move to Florida, but Beth insisted her mother had no relatives there and had never expressed any desire to leave Pine Hollow. Lucy's testimony proved more disturbing. The child described finding her grandmother in the garden at midnight, talking to vegetables that moved funny when Martha touched them. She'd watched from her bedroom window as her grandmother's shadow got smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. When Lucy had told adults about what she'd seen, they'd insisted she'd been having nightmares. Bradley's investigation revealed the same patterns that had frustrated county officials for decades. Records showed Martha Caldwell had lived in Pine Hollow for 8 years, but documentation of her activities was sparse and contradictory. Neighbors offered vague, rehearsed-sounding explanations for her departure, and everyone suggested he speak with the Pruitt family, who apparently served as informal community leaders. His interview with Ezekiel Pruitt took place on the front porch of the family homestead, with Jacob Pruitt present as a silent observer. Ezekiel was polite, articulate, and completely unhelpful. He acknowledged that Martha had been acting strangely before her departure, suggested she'd been suffering from early-stage dementia, and insisted her decision to move to Florida had been sudden but not entirely surprising. Mountain people value their privacy, Ezekiel had explained. Martha didn't want a lot of fuss about leaving, so she asked us to handle the logistics quietly. Sometimes it's kinder to let people go without making them explain themselves to everyone. Bradley had interviewed enough rural families to recognize deflection disguised as folksy wisdom. The Pruitts were hiding something, and their careful control of the conversation suggested they'd had practice managing outside inquiries. But determining what they were hiding would require more than polite questions and social pressure. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Reverend David Parker had been watching from the church when Bradley arrived in Pine Hollow, and the young minister had recognized an opportunity to share the burden of terrible knowledge he'd been carrying alone. That evening, Parker had knocked on Bradley's motel room door in Whitesburg, carrying a briefcase that contained Jeremiah Pruitt's letter and selected pages from the family ledger. "I need to show you something," the minister had said, his hands shaking as he opened the case. "But I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you changes everything about this case." Amanda Torres arrived in Pine Hollow exactly as scheduled, driving a government vehicle loaded with survey equipment and accompanied by 2 research assistants from the University of Kentucky. The federal team had been briefed to expect a typical Appalachian mountain community struggling with economic transition, and their initial observations seemed to confirm that expectation. Pine Hollow presented itself as a model of rural adaptation. Residents were friendly but not overly eager to please. Infrastructure was adequate but not ostentatious, and community leaders offered reasonable explanations for their success in maintaining population stability. Ezekiel Pruitt, serving as informal spokesman, attributed their achievements to traditional values, mutual support networks, and careful resource management. "We take care of our own," he'd explained during Torres's first community meeting. "Always have, always will. Sometimes that means making hard choices, but we've learned to work together in ways that keep everyone fed and housed." The research assistants conducted interviews with residents, while Torres examined community records and infrastructure. Every conversation reinforced the narrative of a tight-knit community that had successfully resisted the social and economic decay affecting similar mountain towns. Residents spoke positively about their neighbors, expressed satisfaction with local leadership, and seemed genuinely committed to maintaining their traditional way of life. But Amanda Torres had spent her career studying rural communities, and she recognized subtle anomalies that didn't fit the conventional pattern. Pine Hollow residents were too consistent in their responses, too uniform in their attitudes toward outside intervention. Their answers sounded coached, as if everyone had been briefed on acceptable topics of conversation. More troubling was what she didn't see. Every successful rural community she'd studied showed evidence of internal conflict, generational tensions, and competing visions for future development. Pine Hollow showed none of these dynamics. The community seemed to operate by consensus so complete that it approached group mind behavior. Torres's investigation was interrupted by Tom Bradley's arrival with Reverend Parker and documentation that transformed the federal assessment, from routine community study to potential criminal investigation. The ledger excerpts Parker had shared revealed evidence of systematic disappearances, unauthorized confinement of community members, and possible involvement in activities that violated multiple federal statutes. "This isn't just a missing person case," Bradley had explained during their emergency meeting in Whitesburg. "This is evidence of a cult-like organization that's been operating without oversight for over a century. The Pruitt family has been deciding who gets to remain fully human and who gets sacrificed for community stability." Torres faced a decision that would determine the fate of Pine Hollow and potentially dozens of similar communities throughout Appalachia. She could file a standard report documenting a successful rural development model, ignoring evidence that suggested federal crimes were being committed. Or she could initiate a full federal investigation that would expose whatever the Pruitt family had been hiding and potentially destroy a community that appeared to be functioning successfully by its own standards. The choice was complicated by the nature of the evidence. Parker's documentation suggested supernatural elements that federal prosecutors would struggle to address through conventional legal frameworks. How do you prosecute someone for stealing shadows? How do you prove in court that a community consists largely of people who've been systematically altered through paranormal means? But Torres also understood that ignoring credible evidence of systematic human rights violations would make her complicit in whatever crimes were being committed in Pine Hollow. Federal oversight existed specifically to protect individuals from community-sanctioned abuse, regardless of whether that abuse was justified by local traditions or supernatural beliefs. Her report to the Appalachian Regional Commission would determine whether Pine Hollow continued operating under its current system or faced federal intervention that could expose secrets the community had successfully hidden for nearly 150 years. The federal investigation that followed Amanda Torres's report lasted 14 months and ultimately concluded with findings that satisfied no one completely. FBI agents discovered the containment facility and documented evidence of unlawful imprisonment, but medical examinations of the residents revealed conditions that defied conventional understanding of mental illness or physical disability. The shadow box was removed from the mine shaft and transported to a classified federal facility where it remains under study by researchers who lack the Pruitt family's generational experience in managing its influence. Without proper containment protocols, the box's effects have begun spreading beyond Pine Hollow, affecting investigators and researchers in ways that government officials prefer not to discuss publicly. Ezekiel Pruitt was convicted of multiple charges related to unlawful confinement and conspiracy, but his sentence was reduced in exchange for cooperation in developing management protocols for the supernatural artifact his family had controlled for 4 generations. He died in federal custody in 1999, taking most of his knowledge about shadow box operations to his grave. Jacob Pruitt disappeared during the federal raid, along with several other community members who'd been deeply involved in the family system. Law enforcement agencies maintain active warrants for their arrest, but no credible sightings have been reported, despite extensive searches throughout Appalachia. The residents of the containment facility were transferred to a secure federal medical facility in Virginia, where they remain under observation by specialists attempting to understand their condition. Some have shown improvement over the years, recovering enough human functionality to participate in limited social interactions. Others have deteriorated further, becoming less human with each passing season. Pine Hollow itself was temporarily evacuated during the investigation, then gradually repopulated by federal personnel and approved residents who undergo regular psychological evaluation. The community serves as an informal research station for studying the long-term effects of supernatural manipulation on human social structures. Martha Caldwell's body was never found, though searchers discovered evidence of graves scattered throughout the mountains surrounding Pine Hollow. Beth Caldwell and her daughter Lucy relocated to Lexington under new identities provided by Federal Witness Protection Services. Lucy, now an adult, occasionally experiences episodes where her shadow appears detached from her body, suggesting that some effects of the shadow box's influence may be hereditary. Reverend David Parker left the ministry after his testimony helped convict the Pruitt family, unable to reconcile his faith with the knowledge that supernatural evil could operate successfully for generations within a Christian community. He currently works as a counselor for families affected by cult involvement, though he rarely discusses the specific details of what he discovered in Pine Hollow. Private investigator Tom Bradley wrote a book about the case that was published by a small press specializing in paranormal investigations, but mainstream media largely ignored his account due to its supernatural elements. He continues investigating similar cases throughout rural America, convinced that Pine Hollow was not unique in harboring secrets that challenge conventional understanding of human nature. The site of the original shadow box chamber has been sealed with concrete and marked as a geological hazard, though motion sensors occasionally detect movement in areas that should be completely empty. Local folklore claims that on certain nights, shadows can be seen moving through the sealed tunnels, seeking their way back to owners, who may no longer be entirely human. Federal officials maintain that the Pine Hollow situation represents an isolated case of cult activity that has been successfully resolved through appropriate law enforcement intervention. But classified reports suggest that similar communities exist throughout Appalachia, places where traditional folk knowledge intersects with supernatural forces in ways that modern institutions struggle to comprehend or control. In these hidden valleys and remote mountain communities, families like the Pruitts continue making choices that no government recognizes and no court system can adjudicate. Guardians of secrets that challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature and the price of survival in America's forgotten places. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.